Think about the last piece of concrete you actually noticed. You cannot, because that is the whole point of concrete. It is the most common building material in the world, poured into sidewalks, driveways, foundations, curbs, and basement floors by the billions of tons every single year, and it is designed, by its very nature, to disappear into usefulness. Nobody stands over a freshly poured sidewalk and remembers the man who mixed it, screeded it flat, and troweled its edges smooth. Nobody names a curb after the crew that formed it. Skilled concrete work is some of the most physically demanding, technically exacting trade labour in the entire building industry. You have a narrow window, often less than an hour in warm weather, between the moment concrete is mixed and the moment it begins to set, and every decision, how much water to add, how long to work the surface, when to stop troweling and let it cure, has to be made correctly the first time, because there is no erasing a bad pour and starting over the way a painter might scrape a canvas clean. It is also, almost by design, some of the most anonymous work in the entire trades, work that succeeds precisely by being forgotten, absorbed invisibly into the ordinary infrastructure of a town within a single generation, judged a success precisely to the degree that nobody ever has reason to think about it again. Now picture a man who did that same kind of work every single day for money to support his family in a small town outside Buffalo, New York in the early decades of the 20th century. His name was Ignaz Erksner. He ran a concrete products business. His wife kept the books. His sons drove the trucks and worked the yard. It was by every measure that mattered to a working immigrant family in that era, an entirely ordinary trade, invisible the moment each job was finished, exactly like every other concrete contractor's work in every other American town. And then picture that same man on evenings and weekends for 25 straight years, using those same trained hands, that same trained eye for how stone and mortar hold weight against gravity, to build something nobody had hired him to build, on a small island in a creek behind his house, entirely for himself. A tower, a gatehouse, a moat. Gargoyles carved by hand into stone he had hauled in himself from a quarry 30 miles away. A castle essentially medieval in style rising slowly out of a 2-acre island in western New York, built by one man's unpaid labour after his paid labour was done for the day, for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the village on the other side of the ocean he had left behind and, as far as anyone can tell, never once returned to. He never finished it. He died with the work still incomplete, sometime around 1942 or 1943, and the castle stands today, more than 80 years later, exactly as unfinished as the day his hand stopped. And the people who now own it, and are spending real money to restore it, have made a deliberate decision not to finish what he started. They are preserving the unfinished part on purpose, because the incompleteness, it turns out, is the truest and most honest thing this place has to say. This is the story of Erksner's Dream Island, sometimes called the Williamsville Castle, sometimes called Cambria Castle, and it is a story about two entirely different things one man's hands built with the exact same skill. The concrete that disappeared and the concrete that never will. Let's start with what we actually know for certain about the man, because the record here is thinner and more scattered than most of the American stories this channel usually tells, pieced together from a handful of newspaper features, a local history book, one genealogical record, and the recollections of a family that has, at times, publicly disputed how accurately the newspapers themselves got the story. That thinness is itself worth naming honestly before we go any further, because it shapes how confidently we can say certain things. Ignaz Erksner was not a public figure in his own lifetime. He gave no interviews that survive, sat for no formal oral history project, left behind no personal papers that any archive has catalogued. Everything we know about his inner motivations comes filtered through other people, a local historian writing decades after his death, newspaper reporters covering a 2017 estate sale 75 years after he died, a family whose own oral traditions have, by their own account, sometimes clashed with what the newspapers printed. That is simply the honest evidentiary shape of this particular story, closer to folklore carefully checked against a handful of hard facts than to a densely documented biography, and it deserves to be treated that way throughout, with appropriate hedging rather than false confidence. Here is what a federal census taker actually wrote down, on paper, in the spring of 1930, standing at the door of a house at 145 South Ellicott Street in the village of Williamsville, New York, a small community a few miles northeast of Buffalo, in the town of Amherst. Living there was a man named Ignaz Oechsner, 55 years old, born in Germany, occupation, manufacturer of concrete products. His wife, Dora, was 60, also born in Germany. Their daughter Hilda, 29, born in Germany, worked as a stenographer for the family's own concrete works. Their son Richard, 26, born in New York, worked as a salesman for the family's own concrete products. Their son Alfred, 22, born in New York, worked as a truck driver for the family's own concrete works. Their son Albert, 17, born in New York, worked as a labourer for the family's own concrete works. A daughter-in-law and an infant granddaughter rounded out the household. Look, too, at what that census entry does not say. There is no line for castle builder. There is no occupation box for the thing that would eventually make this particular Ellicott Street address, out of every house on every street in the entire town of Amherst, worth a documentary 100 years later. To the federal government, to his own neighbours filling out their own census forms on the same street that same spring, Ignaz Oechsner was, on paper, just a local businessman, unremarkable in the specific structural sense that mattered to the state, taxed the same way, categorised the same way, recorded the same way as any other small manufacturer in any other small American town that year. The census could only capture the part of his life that looked like everyone else's. It had no box for the part that didn't. Read that census entry closely because it tells you something important before we even get to the castle. This was not just a side hobby. It was a genuine, multi-generational family business, an immigrant father who had built, by 1930, an entire small concrete manufacturing operation, employing his own wife and at least 3 of his adult children, in sales, in bookkeeping, in driving, in labour. Whatever else Ignaz Oechsner would go on to be remembered for, his actual documented working life was as the head of a working-class family trade business, pouring concrete for other people's houses and streets in and around a small Buffalo suburb, the kind of anonymous essential labour that built thousands of American towns without any individual builder ever being remembered for it. Williamsville itself, the village where all of this took place, was and remains a small historic community built up around Glen Falls, a natural waterfall on Ellicott Creek that had drawn mill operators to the site since the earliest days of European settlement in the area, the falls providing the kind of reliable water power that let a cluster of grist mills and later other small industries take root along the creek. By the time Ignaz Oechsner and his family settled there in the early 20th century, Williamsville had grown into a genuine, if modest, commercial centre for the surrounding farmland. A walkable village of shops and churches and neat residential streets a comfortable distance from, but still well connected to, the much larger industrial city of Buffalo, a few miles to the southwest. It had, by the early 20th century, a settled, prosperous, unremarkable small-town character, mills and shops and neat residential streets, the kind of place where a concrete manufacturer's family business could find steady, reliable local work, sidewalks for new houses, foundations for new buildings, the unglamorous physical infrastructure a growing early 20th century suburb actually needs. It was on that same creek, on a small island barely more than an acre or 2 in size, that Ignaz Oechsner decided, sometime around 1917, to start building something that had nothing to do with sidewalks at all. For why he started, we have to rely on a single, second-hand but locally respected source, a 1965 book called A History of the Town of Amherst, New York, written by a local historian named Sue Miller Young, published more than 20 years after Oechsner's death, drawing on the memories of people in the community who had known him, or known of him. According to Young's account, Oechsner was, in her words, homesick for his native village, a place her book renders as Oxenfurt on the Main River. That is almost certainly in the more standard spelling Oxenfurt, a genuine centuries-old town on the Main River in Bavaria, in southern Germany, its name built from the old German words for oxen and ford, the crossing point where cattle once forded the river. It is worth noticing, without making too much of it, that Oechsner's own surname likely traces back to that same place-name root, an Oxherds or Oxentowns family, carrying a small linguistic echo of the very village he was, according to his neighbours, homesick for. Oxenfurt itself, if this identification is correct, is a truly picturesque, historically layered market town, with a medieval town wall still largely intact, half-timbered houses lining narrow streets, and a skyline of towers and gabled roofs that has changed comparatively little in outward character since the late medieval period. The kind of place where a boy growing up in the early 1900s would have had, quite literally, actual castle towers and fortified stone walls as part of his everyday visual world, the ordinary backdrop of walking to school or to market, rather than something encountered only in books or later, second-hand descriptions. If that was in fact the world 8-year-old or 12-year-old Ignaz Oechsner grew up walking through, it becomes considerably easier to understand why, decades later and an ocean away, that specific visual vocabulary, towers, arched stone, fortified walls, was the one his hands reached for when he finally had the means and the motive to build something entirely for himself. Young's account goes further, describing Oechsner as determined to build exactly the medieval castle that was so familiar to him in his early boyhood. Not a castle in general, this was not just a folly. It was a specific remembered building, or perhaps a composite of several remembered buildings from the actual town he'd grown up in and then left, presumably as a young man crossing the Atlantic the way millions of other Germans did in this same period, seeking work and opportunity in industrial America, and finding it, eventually, in the concrete trade of a small town outside Buffalo. It helps to place Oechsner inside the larger wave of German immigration he was almost certainly part of. Between the mid-1800s and the outbreak of the First World War, several million Germans crossed the Atlantic to the United States, one of the largest sustained waves of immigration in American history, drawn by a combination of agricultural crisis and land shortage at home, political upheaval, and the simple, powerful pull of American industrial wage labour, which paid more in a single week than many rural German trades could offer in a month. Buffalo, sitting on Lake Erie at the western end of the Erie Canal, had become, by the turn of the 20th century, one of the most heavily German-American cities in the entire country, with German-language newspapers, German churches, German social clubs, and entire neighbourhoods where a new arrival could live, work, and raise a family largely within a German-speaking community for years before ever needing to master much English. Oechsner's path, a young tradesman from Bavaria settling in the Buffalo area, building a skilled labour's business, and raising his family among a substantial existing German-American community, fits that broader pattern closely, one immigrant's story folded into a much larger regional history of precisely this kind of migration. There is no record in any of the sources gathered for this account of Oechsner ever travelling back to Germany once he had settled in Williamsville. Immigration in this era was, for a working-class tradesman raising a growing family on a single business's income, very often close to a one-way transaction, expensive and logistically difficult to reverse even for people who wanted badly to go home, and by the time Oechsner might have had the means to make a return visit, the First World War, and later the Second, would have made travel back to Germany from the United States truly dangerous or impossible for long stretches at a time. Whatever the exact reasons, the pattern that emerges from the record is a familiar one in immigrant history. A man who left a specific, remembered place as a young person, built an entirely new life an ocean away, and never physically returned to the place that had shaped his earlier sense of what home was supposed to look like. So, sometime around 1917, roughly a decade or more after establishing himself and his family in Williamsville, Ignaz Oechsner began to build that place back, not in memory, not in photographs, but in stone, on a small island in Ellicott Creek, using the exact professional skill he used every working day to build other people's ordinary houses. Here is where the day job and the dream job start to run side by side, and it is worth holding both of them in view at once because the contrast is the whole shape of this story. By day, in the 1910s and 1920s and into the 1930s, Ignaz Oechsner mixed concrete to specification, poured it into wooden forms his customers had paid for, screeded and finished it to a professional standard, and moved on to the next job, the next sidewalk, the next foundation, work measured in cubic yards and billed by the job, indistinguishable, once cured and cured over, from any other competent concrete contractor's output anywhere in Erie County. It was skilled work, honest work, the kind of steady trade that let him support a wife and at least 4 children and put 3 of those children on his own payroll. And it left, by design, almost no individual trace. Nobody driving down a Williamsville street today could point to a specific sidewalk slab and say, Oechsner poured that one, personally, in 1924. The work became the town, absorbed into its ordinary infrastructure the moment it was finished. On his own island, he worked completely differently and completely alone, or nearly so, using stone rather than poured concrete for most of the visible structure. Fieldstone hauled in specifically from the town of Holland, a rural community roughly 30 miles south of Williamsville, chosen presumably for the particular colour, texture, and fossil-embedded character of its native rock, which period photographs and later descriptions specifically call out as fossil rock, stone old enough to carry the compressed traces of ancient sea creatures inside its own structure, a fittingly deep kind of material to build a memory out of. Consider the sheer logistics of that choice for a moment, because it says something about how deliberate this project actually was. The town of Holland sits roughly 30 miles south of Williamsville, a genuine day's round trip by the standards of early 20th century roads and vehicles, and Uxner did not simply use whatever stone happened to be lying around his own property, which would have been the easier, cheaper, far less labour-intensive choice for an ordinary building project. He went and got a specific kind of stone, from a specific place, prized, evidently, for its particular fossil-flecked character and colour, and hauled it back, load by load, presumably fitting these trips around an already full working schedule running his own concrete business. That is not just a hobby. It is the behaviour of someone with a very specific material and aesthetic vision in mind, unwilling to substitute a lesser, more convenient stone for the one that actually matched what he was trying to recreate. He hauled that stone back to the island, piece by piece, over literal decades, and set it by hand into walls, towers and arches, using the same fundamental masonry skills his day job depended on. Mortar mixed and trowelled with a professional's competence, but aimed now at an entirely unprofessional, unpaid, deeply personal target. Do the arithmetic on that kind of schedule for a moment, because it clarifies just how much of this man's actual life the project consumed. 25 years, working by every indication, primarily in the hours left over after a full day running a working concrete business, and raising a family of at least 4 children. Even at a conservative estimate, a few hours most evenings, more on weekends, that adds up to many thousands of hours of unpaid, physically demanding labour, hauling stone, mixing mortar, setting blocks, carving decorative detail, over a stretch of time longer than most people spend on their entire formal education, longer than most careers last inside a single company, an entire second working life run in parallel with the first one, visible to almost nobody outside his own family and immediate neighbours, until the project had grown large enough to become a genuine local landmark in its own right. What rose out of that decades-long evening and weekend labour was not a single simple structure, but a small, sprawling complex. A main castle building, built up gradually with towers and turreted rooflines evoking, deliberately, the medieval architecture of the Bavarian countryside Uxner remembered. A separate gatehouse, still today the one part of the property most visible from the public road, a small stone structure marking the entrance to the private access route onto the island. A tower, a room the family and local visitors came to call, with a certain playful theatrical flourish. The dungeon, almost certainly not an actual medieval dungeon in any functional sense, no chains, no cells, nothing grim about its actual use, but a deliberately atmospheric stone room, low-ceilinged and heavy-walled, built to feel like one, the same instinct that shapes any good piece of folk architecture built for the sheer pleasure of the image rather than any practical necessity. It is worth imagining what that room must have meant to the children who grew up in this family across the generations, a genuine, honest-to-goodness castle dungeon down the hall from their own bedroom, the kind of detail that turns an unusual childhood home into the stuff of a lifetime of stories told to friends who, understandably, often did not quite believe them until they were finally invited to come see for themselves. A coach house, and around and through all of it, gardens, stone-lined paths, retaining walls and steps, ornamental fountains, small footbridges crossing the water in several places, and running around a meaningful portion of the island's edge, an actual moat, dug and lined by hand, water drawn from the same creek the island itself sat in. A truly remarkable feat of one-man landscape engineering, layered on top of the stonework itself. And then there were the details, the parts of the project that go beyond simple structural competence into something closer to genuine folk art. The kind of embellishment nobody strictly needs to add to a functional wall or tower, but that a builder adds anyway, because the whole point of the project was never mere function in the first place. Gargoyles, carved by hand into stone, peering out from cornices and roof lines the way they would on an actual medieval European building, half decoration, and half, in the old tradition, meant to ward off evil spirits, a detail Uxner would have known intimately from the actual Bavarian architecture of his childhood rather than from any storybook version of a castle. Animal reliefs, carved figures worked directly into the stone surfaces, arched cornices, curved stone detailing along the roofline requiring real skill and patience to execute correctly by hand, one stone at a time, without the benefit of any factory-cut standardized architectural component. And, in one of the more distinctly charming and specific details to survive in photographs of the property, a dedicated tower built to house carrier pigeons, a small architectural nod to an old-world hobby, and, in an earlier era, a truly useful old-world communication technology incorporated into the castle the way a person building their dream house today might build in a home office or a wine cellar, a piece of the builder's actual daily interests made permanent in stone. There is a recognizable category of American building this project belongs to, even if it rarely gets a tidy single name: the outsider-built environment, structures raised by a single untrained or semi-trained visionary, working alone, over decades, entirely outside the ordinary channels of architecture and construction, often for reasons rooted in memory, faith, or private obsession, rather than any commercial or civic purpose. Watts Towers in Los Angeles, built by an Italian immigrant tile setter across more than 3 decades using scrap steel and broken pottery. Coral Castle in Florida, built by a Latvian immigrant stonemason working largely alone with massive coral rock blocks. Salvation Mountain in the California desert. None of these builders knew each other, none coordinated in any way, and yet the pattern recurs across American history with striking consistency. Skilled immigrant tradesmen, often working in an ordinary building trade by day, who spend decades of unpaid personal labor building something monumental, strange, and deeply specific to a private inner life nobody around them fully understood while it was happening. Exner's Dream Island belongs unmistakably to that same tradition, a genuine, if lesser known, entry in America's long, quiet history of solitary, obsessive, hand-built folk monuments. It is worth pausing on what all of this must have looked like to Uxner's actual neighbors, watching this project rise slowly across the better part of 3 decades. The German immigrant concrete contractor, whose day job everyone in the neighborhood already knew and understood, quietly building an entire castle, gargoyles and all, on a small island behind his own property, using his own money, his own weekends, and, by most accounts, largely his own 2 hands. There is no record of significant local opposition or controversy around the project, no zoning fight, no newspaper campaign against it, which is itself worth noting because plenty of ambitious, unconventional owner-built structures in American history have drawn that same kind of hostile scrutiny from neighbors uncomfortable with anything too far outside the ordinary. Williamsville, by whatever combination of small-town tolerance, genuine local affection, or simple lack of any legal mechanism to stop a man from building on his own land, appears to have simply let Ignaz Uxner build his castle, one hauled stone at a time for a quarter of a century, largely undisturbed. That tolerance, whatever its exact source, is part of why the castle exists at all today. It is worth remembering that formal residential zoning, the whole modern American apparatus of building permits, setback requirements, and use restrictions that would almost certainly complicate, if not outright prevent, a project like this one today, was still a relatively new and unevenly applied legal tool in the 1910s and 1920s, especially in smaller villages and towns well outside a major city's own more tightly regulated core. Williamsville in this era had far less regulatory machinery standing between a property owner and an unconventional building project than an equivalent town would have today. A more restrictive town, a more litigious set of neighbors, or a more aggressive local zoning board in almost any other era of American suburban development, including, quite possibly, the present one, might well have shut the project down long before it ever grew into anything resembling the structure that survives now. He died in 1942, or, by some accounts, 1943. Sources disagree on the precise year by a matter of months, somewhere in his late 60s, roughly 25 years after he had started hauling the first loads of Holland fieldstone onto his island. And the castle, at the moment of his death, was not finished. It had never been finished. 25 years of nights and weekends, an entire main building, a gatehouse, a tower, a dungeon, a coach house, a hand-dug moat, gardens, bridges, gargoyles, and a pigeon tower, and still, somewhere on that island, there was a section of wall that simply stopped, mid-course, exactly where his hands had left it the last time he worked on it, stone laid up to a certain height, and then, permanently, no higher. Nobody has ever finished it. That is the detail worth sitting with, because it would have been entirely possible, at almost any point over the following 80-plus years, for a subsequent owner, a wealthy enthusiast, a preservation society, anyone with the resources and the inclination to hire a mason and complete Ursna's original design, closing the gap between what he built and whatever fuller vision he was presumably carrying around in his own head. Nobody ever did. The family that inherited the property kept it, lived in it, loved it by every visible measure of 100 years of continuous stewardship, but they did not, at any point in the historical record available here, attempt to complete the castle's construction according to Ursna's own original plan. And the restoration effort underway on the island today, run by its newest owners, states its goal explicitly not as finishing what Ursna started, but as preserving what he actually built, in the state he actually left it. Think about what that means for the physical object itself. Somewhere on the island right now in 2026, there is a specific place where cut mortared stone simply ends and nothing has ever been added to it since. A permanent physical record of the exact moment a man's 25-year private act of memory building stopped. Not because he chose to stop, not because he decided the castle was finished, but because he died. It is, in a very real sense, the single most honest structural feature anywhere on the property, more honest than any finished tower or completed gatehouse, because a finished structure tells you what a builder intended. An unfinished one tells you where a life actually ran out. Picture what that edge likely looks like based on how hand-laid fieldstone construction of this kind typically stops mid-project. A course of stone rising to a certain height, mortar joints tooled and finished the way a professional's hand finishes them out of pure habit, even on a project nobody was paying him for, and then, abruptly, nothing. No taper, no deliberate stopping point, no decorative cap course signalling an intentional conclusion. Just stone, and then absence. Exactly the kind of interruption that happens when a person fully intends to come back to something tomorrow and simply never gets the chance to. That is the object at the centre of this whole story, more than the gargoyles, more than the moat, more than the carrier pigeon tower. It is the unfinished edge itself, and the fact that everyone who has owned this property since 1942 or 1943, across more than 80 years and at least 3 or 4 generations of stewardship, has chosen, whether by neglect, by reverence, or by both at once, to leave that edge exactly where it was. If the idea of an unfinished stone edge, left exactly where a man's hand stopped 80 years ago, has stayed with you the way it stays with most people the first time they hear about it, you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for, and subscribing keeps these smaller, stranger, more personal American stories coming, alongside the bigger civic and institutional ones, because the castle's story does not end with Ursna's death. It survives him by more than 80 years, through fire, through generations of family ownership, through decades of quiet decline, and, most recently, through an entirely new chapter that only began within the last year or so. 14 years after Ursna's death in 1956, fire broke out inside the main castle building and destroyed its interior. The stonework itself, being stone, survived. Fire does far less damage to a mortared fieldstone structure than it does to a conventionally framed wooden house. But everything inside, whatever furniture, whatever finishes, whatever personal belongings the family had accumulated across nearly 2 decades of living inside Ignaz Ursna's unfinished dream, was lost. The building was refurnished afterward, specifically, according to the record, to accommodate the family who was living there at the time. Fires of this kind, striking a stone structure's wooden interior finishes, ceiling joists, floor framing, staircases, cabinetry, tend to be truly devastating even when the outer walls survive intact, and rebuilding an interior from scratch in the mid-1950s would have represented a real substantial financial commitment for any family, let alone one maintaining an already unusual and labour-intensive property. That the family chose to rebuild and keep living there, rather than selling the stone shell and walking away, tells us something important on its own. The castle had not, by 1956, become a museum piece, or a curiosity kept at arm's length by its own family. It was, fire and all, still just someone's actual home, damaged and repaired the way any family repairs and keeps living in a house that has survived a serious fire. Ownership stayed within the family for decades afterward, generation folding into generation the way it often does with an unusual, beloved, difficult-to-sell property like this one. Think about what it would actually mean to inherit a place like this, rather than an ordinary house. Every ordinary American inheritance question, do we sell it? Do we split the proceeds? Do one of us buy the others out? Gets complicated enormously when the asset in question is not just a house with a market comparable a few streets over, but a one-of-a-kind, hand-built castle with no real equivalent anywhere else in the region. A place that carries not just financial value, but the accumulated weight of family identity itself. The thing that made this particular family locally known, locally distinctive, the answer to, "Oh, you're one of the castle people at church or at the grocery store for 4 generations running." Selling a place like that is never just a financial transaction. It is also, unavoidably, a decision about what your family's story is going to be going forward. And it is not hard to understand why, generation after generation, the answer kept coming back the same way. Not yet, not this generation, let's keep it a little longer. A place too personally significant to easily let go of and, by most ordinary real estate logic, too strange and too labour-intensive to be an obviously attractive sale even if a family did want out. By the early 21st century, the property belonged to 2 sisters, Mildred O'Rourke and Onali Davies, the latest in what was by then close to a century of continuous family stewardship. 2 women who had, by all accounts, grown up understanding this improbable stone island as simply part of their own family inheritance, their own particular, strange, wonderful version of a family home. That long chapter of quiet family ownership ended in practical terms in April of 2017. Mildred O'Rourke had died. Her sister Onali Davies had moved into assisted living. And for the first time in the property's more than 100-year history, the family that had held it since Ignaz Ursner's own lifetime needed to empty it out. They held an estate sale over 3 days beginning April 27, 2017, and the response from the surrounding community was by any measure extraordinary for what was, on paper, just a household liquidation. Thousands of people came, drawn by 2 overlapping but distinct motives. Some came, as people do at any estate sale, to buy things, furniture, decorative objects, whatever 80-plus years of a family's accumulated life inside a working castle had left behind. But a great many more came for a rarer, stranger reason. Simple, long-denied curiosity. This was a property that had sat, visible but essentially inaccessible, on the edge of local awareness for a century, a place Williamsville area residents had grown up hearing about, glimpsing from the road, half believing in the way you half believe in any local landmark you have never actually been allowed to walk through. Local news photographers covering the sale captured images of long lines forming along the private access road well before the gates opened each morning. Families and older residents who remembered the castle from their own childhoods standing alongside younger visitors who had only ever heard about it second-hand. Everyone waiting for the same rare chance to finally cross a threshold most of them had driven past hundreds of times without ever being able to enter. The estate sale was, for a great many of those thousands of visitors, the first and possibly only chance they would ever get to actually step inside the gate and see it for themselves. The sale's own promotional materials leaned into that mystique. They described the property as having, in the company's own phrasing, underpinnings in vaudeville, and spoke of many fascinating inhabitants through the years. Language colourful enough to be worth mentioning here, but thin enough, in terms of independent verification, that it deserves to be flagged plainly as promotional colour rather than established history. No source gathered for this account confirms precisely what the vaudeville connection actually was, whether a specific performer once lived on the island, whether Ursner himself had some tie to the entertainment world alongside his concrete business, or whether the phrase was just evocative marketing language meant to heighten the property's air of theatrical mystery ahead of a well-attended sale. It is one of several places in this story where the honest answer is that we simply do not know, and pretending otherwise would be worse than saying so plainly. What we do know is that the sale drew school groups and curiosity seekers alike, and that local press coverage described the family as having, over the decades, generously allowed school children and community groups to tour the grounds and buildings on occasion. Picture what that must have meant practically for generations of Williamsville area school children. A local field trip unlike anything most American school children ever get to experience. Walking across a private footbridge onto an actual island, past a hand-dug moat, into a genuine if unfinished stone castle built by one man's own 2 hands, guided by the very family that still called it home. That kind of informal, generous, unofficial local access, offered by a private family with no obligation to share their own home with the public at all, is its own quiet testament to how the Ursner family understood their inheritance, not as a private trophy to be jealously guarded, but as something worth sharing, in careful, limited doses, with the wider community the castle had always, in its own strange way, belonged to. By 2017, though, the castle was, by its own promotional material's own admission, showing real signs of its 100-plus years of age, structures that needed attention the family could no longer easily provide. The years that followed the 2017 sale were not kind to the island, and it is worth stating that plainly rather than skipping straight to the eventual happy turn, because the gap between those two moments is its own honest, important part of the story. A family's love for a property, even a century of it, is not the same thing as an institution's resources, and Exner's Dream Island is a truly difficult, expensive kind of structure to maintain properly. Western New York's climate is particularly punishing for this exact kind of hand-laid masonry. Heavy annual snowfall off Lake Erie, and more damaging still, dozens of freeze-thaw cycles every winter as temperatures swing back and forth across the freezing point, water seeping into every hairline crack in old mortar, freezing, expanding, and slowly, relentlessly widening those cracks year after year. A slow mechanical erosion that professionally engineered modern structures are specifically designed to resist, and that a one-man hand-mixed mortar job from the 1920s and 1930s was never going to be built to withstand indefinitely, without regular expert reinforcement. Add to that a hand-dug moat requiring ongoing water management, gardens that need continuous attention, or they simply revert to wilderness within a handful of growing seasons, and you have a property that was, structurally, always going to need far more sustained professional investment than any single family, however devoted, could realistically provide across 100-plus unbroken years. By the time serious restoration attention finally arrived, the property's own current stewardship organisation describes the island's original structures in blunt terms: overgrown and beginning to fail. Stone walls Erksner had built by hand were losing their mortar. Garden features he had shaped with evident care had been swallowed by decades of unchecked plant growth. The moat itself, along significant stretches of shoreline, had degraded into what the current restoration effort describes as a failing, non-historic condition requiring genuine ecological rebuilding rather than simple cosmetic repair. This is not just neglect. It is a story about limits, and by every indication in the record, the family that held this property loved it, lived in it, and shared it generously with school groups and curious neighbours for generations. It is instead a story about the plain, unglamorous limits of what private, informal, generational stewardship can actually accomplish across a 100-plus year timescale, without the kind of dedicated professional preservation funding, expertise, and staffing that a formally designated historic site or a well-endowed private foundation might bring to bear. Love kept the castle standing and kept it in the family. Love alone did not stop the mortar from failing or the gardens from going wild. Those are two different, both entirely honest facts about the same 100 years. That is the situation the property's newest owners walked into. In 2026, for the first time in more than 60 years, Exner's Dream Island changed hands outside the family that had held it since not long after the original builder's own death. A couple named Cheryl and Jason Davies purchased the property through a limited liability company for a reported price of $750,000. They were not strangers to the island before the sale closed. According to their own account, they had lived nearby, on a street called, with a coincidence almost too neat to be believable, Castle Creek, close enough that the castle itself would have been a familiar everyday landmark of their own neighbourhood, long before it was ever theirs to own, the kind of proximity that turns a strange local curiosity into something closer to a quiet, ongoing personal fascination. They had been using the private access road onto the island for a couple of years already before the purchase, an informal, gradual familiarity with the place that suggests this was not an impulsive real estate acquisition, but something closer to a long, patient courtship of a property they had already come to care about before it was ever formally theirs. There is a small, satisfying symmetry in that, a family that lived on a street named for a castle eventually coming to own the actual castle nearby. The kind of detail that would read as too tidy in a work of fiction, but happens, every so often, to be just how things unfold in the real unscripted world. Their stated plan, and the plan of the broader restoration effort now underway on the island, is not to modernise the property into something new, and notably not to finish Ignaz Erksner's original incomplete design either. It is to restore what already exists, the stonework, the gardens, the paths, the moat, back toward the condition and character it held closer to the height of its builder's own lifetime, while accepting permanently that the castle itself will remain exactly as unfinished as he left it. The restoration organisation associated with the property describes its purpose in a single, deliberately chosen word: sanctuary. The same word, not coincidentally, that seems to capture something true about what the island has always actually been. First for one homesick immigrant seeking in stone a private refuge that felt like the home he had left behind, and now for a new set of caretakers seeking to protect that refuge for whatever comes next. A landscape design firm brought onto the project has laid out an ambitious, ecologically minded plan, organised around 4 distinct garden character areas: a formal garden section, echoing the structured geometric planting beds a European-trained eye like Ushna's own might have favoured; a cottage garden, looser and more informal; a Japanese-inspired garden, bringing an entirely different cultural design tradition into conversation with the site's original Bavarian inspiration; and a naturalistic floodplain garden, working with rather than against the fact that this entire property sits on an island in a creek prone to seasonal flooding, planting species that can actually tolerate periodic inundation, rather than fighting a losing battle against the water every spring. Invasive plant species are being systematically removed and replaced with native plantings. The failing sections of shoreline are being rebuilt using natural materials, native trees and shrubs rather than the hard, non-historic reinforcement that had degraded over recent decades. And the deteriorating stone walls Uxner himself once laid are being restored, carefully, stone by stone, to match, as closely as modern preservation practice allows, his own original 19-teens and 20s and 30s craftsmanship. Work that requires masons today to essentially reverse engineer one long-dead amateur builder's specific techniques and material choices, rather than simply applying whatever modern masonry standard would be fastest or cheapest. And here is the detail that matters most, the one that closes the loop this entire story has been building toward. The restoration is not adding a single new tower. It is not completing the unfinished section of wall where Uxner's hand stopped in 1942 or 1943. It is choosing, deliberately, carefully at real financial cost, to preserve that unfinished edge exactly as it is, alongside everything else he actually built, because the people doing the restoring understand something that a simpler, tidier story about this castle might miss entirely. The unfinished part is not a flaw in Ignaz Uxner's life's work that needs correcting. It is the single most truthful thing about it. There is one more honest thing to say before we close, because it would be easy, at this point in the story, to picture a tidy, public-facing happy ending, a restored castle, a visitor centre, a plaque, a gift shop, the kind of resolution American preservation stories often reach for. That is not, at least not yet, and possibly not ever, what is actually happening here. Uxner's Dream Island remains today private property, and its current stewards have been explicit and direct about that fact. Outside photographers and filmmakers are not permitted on the island while restoration work is underway. There is no public tour to book, no visitor's entrance, no admission fee, because there is, at this stage, no public admission at all. The only way an ordinary person can see any part of this castle today is by driving to a specific clearing along Oak Grove Drive in Williamsville and looking, from a public road, at the gatehouse, the one structure visible from outside the property line, and nothing more. Everything else described in this video, the main castle building, the tower, the dungeon, the moat, the gardens, the exact unfinished edge of stone where Ignaz Uxner's work stopped in the early 1940s, sits behind a private access road most local residents have never walked down, protected as much by simple legal privacy as by any lock or gate. Even the images that do circulate publicly, in old postcards from the 1930s bearing captions like Uxner's Dream Island, Williamsville, New York, in newspaper photographs from the 2017 estate sale, in occasional aerial or drone footage shared online before the current no-filming policy took effect, are historical snapshots rather than a live, ongoing window into the property. What the castle looks like today, mid-restoration, is known mostly to the small circle of owners, contractors, and landscape designers actually doing the work, a level of privacy that would be almost unimaginable for a comparably famous landmark anywhere with formal public or museum status. That is worth sitting with, because it means the title of this very video, A Handmade Castle Hidden on a Two-Acre Island, is not exaggeration or clickbait framing. It is a plainly, currently, literally accurate description. This is one of the more distinctly obscure, hard-to-access landmarks this channel has ever covered, better documented in some ways, in scattered newspaper clippings and a single 1965 local history book, than it is visible to anyone who might want to actually go look at it in person. The story you have just heard is, in a very real sense, more accessible than the place itself. Step back at the end and look at the whole shape of what one man's two kinds of labour actually produced, because that contrast is the real heart of this story. More than the gargoyles, more than the moat, more than the fire or the estate sale or even the recent hopeful turn toward restoration. Ignaz Oechsner spent most of his working life pouring concrete for other people. Competent, honest, professional labour that dissolved, almost immediately, into the ordinary infrastructure of a small American town. Sidewalks and foundations nobody remembers the individual builder of, because that is simply what that kind of work is for. And he spent his evenings and weekends for 25 years using that exact same trained skill, aimed instead at something nobody had asked him to build, something with no customer, no invoice, no practical necessity behind it at all, beyond the private, wordless need to make a lost place feel, again, physically real under his own hands. One version of his craft was built to be used up and forgotten. The other was built, without him ever quite intending it this way, to become the single thing his entire life is now remembered for. There is no surviving record of Ignaz Oechsner ever explaining, in his own words, exactly why he built what he built. No diary entry, no letter home, no interview granted to a curious reporter in his own lifetime. Everything we understand about his motive comes second-hand, through a local historian writing decades after his death, through the shape of the object itself, through the plain fact that a man who could have easily saved his money or improved his own ordinary house, instead spent 25 years hauling stone across a creek to build something that resembled, as closely as memory and skill could manage it, a specific village on the other side of an ocean he never crossed again. Sometimes the clearest account of what someone was feeling is not a sentence they wrote. It is the shape of what they built with their hands when nobody was paying them to build anything at all. There is a particular kind of dignity in that, worth naming plainly before we close. American history tends to remember its builders through their biggest, wealthiest, most commercially successful projects. The mansion, the factory, the skyscraper with a name carved over the door. Ignaz Oechsner left behind no fortune, no company that outlived him under his own name, no biography anyone thought to write down while he was still alive to correct it. What he left behind was a half-finished stone castle on a 2-acre island, built entirely out of hours nobody paid him for, using a trade skill everybody in his own lifetime would have considered entirely ordinary. And it is that project, not the paid concrete work that actually supported his family for decades, that has outlasted him by more than 80 years and counting, that draws thousands of curious visitors to a single estate sale, that a new set of owners is now spending real money to protect. The unpaid hours turned out to matter more in the end than the paid ones, at least for the specific narrow question of what a single human life gets remembered for. And when he died, mid-project, the castle simply stopped, exactly where his labour stopped, and it has stayed that way for more than 80 years since, through a fire, through 4 generations of family stewardship, through a widely attended estate sale, through years of quiet decline, and now through a careful, deliberate, well-funded restoration that has made the unusual, thoughtful choice not to finish what he started. The unfinished edge of stone on that island is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is the truest surviving record of exactly how far one man's grief for a lost home could carry him, in stone, by hand, over a quarter of a century before his own life simply ran out first. Somewhere in western New York right now, on a small island most people driving past on the surrounding streets have no idea even exists. There is a specific piece of stone wall that a man's hands touched for the last time sometime around 1942 or 1943, and then never touched again. It is being cared for today, gently, deliberately, by people who never met him and who have decided in the most direct possible way that the kindest thing they can do for his memory is to leave that one edge exactly as unfinished as it has always been. Most of what any of us build in a working lifetime disappears the way Ignaz Oechsner's sidewalks disappeared, absorbed into the ordinary infrastructure of a town, unremembered by name within a generation, which is not a tragedy, just the ordinary fate of most honest labour everywhere. But every so often somebody spends their unpaid hours building something with no customer and no deadline and no practical purpose at all, beyond a private need to make a lost place feel real again under their own two hands, and if they are very fortunate or perhaps simply patient enough, what they build outlasts them, imperfect and incomplete, exactly as they left it, still standing 80 years later on a 2-acre island behind a gate most of their own neighbours have never walked through, still, in its own quiet, unfinished way, exactly what he meant it to be.